Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be, traveling back in time, really, to explore, honestly, a connection that sends chills down my spine, that link between economic turmoil and, how authoritarian leaders rise.
Yeah.
We'll be diving into your research on two very different figures, Adolf Hitler in Germany and Fidel Castro in Cuba. You've got some fascinating material here highlighting how economic hardship created an opening, though their journeys and ideologies, worlds apart.
Yeah, it really is like a historical experiment, isn't it? You see the same underlying conditions, so economic crisis and instability, right?
Yeah.
And it leads to these drastically different forms of authoritarianism.
Okay, so Germany. You've included some pretty vivid descriptions of the aftermath of that '29 Wall Street crash, and Germany was already vulnerable right after World War I. This economic collapse, it sent them into a tailspin. Hyperinflation, mass unemployment, 6 million Germans out of work by 1932. Like you said, a recipe for disaster.
Absolutely. People were desperate, right? Desperate for solutions.
Sure.
And the Weimar Republic, it seemed powerless. Like they couldn't stop that downward spiral, And this is where Hitler and the Nazi Party, they seized their chance.
You highlighted something really interesting in your notes, the Nazis' mastery of propaganda. They didn't just exploit the situation, they shaped the narrative, you know?
Absolutely.
Like that quote from Hitler you pulled out, "The November criminals destroyed the German people and only a national revolution can save us."
Yeah.
Just reading those words, you can almost feel the fear, the anger he was tapping into.
It's really a chilling example of how effectively he twisted collective trauma, so like the memory of World War I, right, into a weapon.
Wow.
He deflected blame away from the government, and then he directed it towards these scapegoats, the Treaty of Versailles, communists, Jewish people.
And tragically, it worked, right? Millions of Germans struggling to survive, just latching on to these simplistic explanations. But Hitler's rise, it wasn't just about rhetoric, though. He also understood the power of chaos.
Exactly. And the Reichstag Fire, 1933, that's a perfect example.
Oh, right.
Many historians believe the Nazis, they set the fire themselves.
Wow.
But they used it, and they used it brilliantly. A blatant, blatant power grab disguised as, oh, this is just a necessary response to a national crisis.
The suspension of civil liberties, the arrests of political opponents, talk about a slippery slope. And from your research, it seems like the Enabling Act was, that was the nail in the coffin.
Essentially, yes. The Enabling Act, that's what handed Hitler dictatorial powers. So it effectively dismantled the Weimar Republic. Within, a few short years, he transformed Germany from this fledgling democracy, into this totalitarian state, the Third Reich.
It's a
chilling reminder of how quickly freedoms can erode when fear and uncertainty take hold.
Okay, so we've seen how economic collapse fueled Hitler's rise in Germany. Now, Cuba, where the economic backdrop, it was quite different. You point out that unlike Germany's sudden crash, Cuba had been grappling with deep-seated economic inequality for decades.
Precisely. One of your sources, it paints a very vivid picture of these American companies, right?
Yeah.
Dominating key industries, sugar particularly.
Yeah.
Essentially, turning Cuba into a neo-colony. And this wasn't just about economics. It was about power, control, resentment towards foreign influence.
Yeah, it's easy to see how this created this, yearning for change. And then you have Fulgencio Batista, a dictator who, only seemed to make things worse with his blatant corruption. Your sources describe him, catering to the wealthy elite while just, completely ignoring the plight of everyday Cubans.
He was a powder keg, just waiting to explode.
Right.
And that's where Fidel Castro enters the scene, a young, charismatic lawyer who, as you highlighted in your notes, was deeply affected by the poverty, the injustice all around him.
And this is where he began his journey to becoming, this revolutionary figure. Your sources mention his daring, albeit unsuccessful, attempt to overthrow Batista in 1953, the attack on the Moncada barracks.
Yeah, and even though it failed, that event, that was pivotal. Castro's "History will absolve me" speech from his trial.
Yeah.
That became a rallying cry for the revolution.
Wow. It's amazing how a single speech can just ignite a movement. But it wasn't just the words themselves. It was the way he articulated the frustrations of a people who'd been ignored for far too long.
Absolutely. He expertly tapped into this widespread anger toward Batista, right?
Yeah.
This resentment towards foreign influence. And he offered this vision of a more just and equitable Cuba. And crucially, he wasn't afraid to use force to achieve his goals.
And this is where Che Guevara comes in, right? You mentioned this in your research, how he became like this key ally, helping Castro strategize, lead that 26th of July movement in their guerrilla war against Batista's regime.
Their guerrilla tactics, launched from the Sierra Maestra Mountains, they were incredibly effective. And unlike Hitler, who manipulated the system from within, Castro and Guevara, they led grassroots revolution.
Interesting.
Relying on popular support to overthrow Batista.
And by January 1959, they had succeeded. Batista fled Cuba, Castro's revolution, it had triumphed. So we have two very different paths to power, both fueled by economic turmoil. Hitler exploiting chaos, manipulating the system in Germany, while Castro led the socialist revolution in Cuba, fueled by that deep-seated resentment and inequality.
And yet, as your research suggests, both ultimately led to authoritarian regimes. Which raises the question, is it even possible for a revolution, born from economic hardship to truly deliver on its promises?
Right.
Like equality, freedom, or does power inevitably corrupt no matter the ideology? Yeah. It really is fascinating, isn't it, how these two leaders, driven by such different ideologies, took such different paths to power, but both ended up creating, well, authoritarian regimes. It kind of speaks to that seductive nature of power, especially in times of crisis.
Yeah, no, it's a sobering thought for sure. So let's unpack what happened next. How did Castro reshape their countries once they, seized control?
Well, let's start with Hitler's economic policies. He was laser-focused on rebuilding Germany, primarily through, state-directed projects and rapid militarization.
One project that immediately comes to mind from your research is the Autobahn, right? That famous German highway system. I remember learning about it in school, but I never really connected it to, authoritarianism,
Yeah. It's a fascinating example of how even infrastructure can be used for political ends. The Autobahn, it wasn't just about connecting cities, boosting the economy. It was about projecting this image, of progress and power, both domestically and internationally. Yeah. And of course, they had a very, very clear military purpose as well, right? Facilitating the movement of troops, equipment.
That's incredible how something seemingly so benign can be so intertwined with such dark intentions.
And then there's this massive expansion of military production under Hitler. Yeah. He blatantly disregarded those restrictions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles, just rapidly building up Germany's military might, which, of course, this played a significant role in the outbreak of World War II.
Yeah. It's a chilling reminder that short-term gains can have some pretty catastrophic long-term consequences, right? But it wasn't just about economics and military power, though, is it? Your research, it also highlights those horrific social policies that he implemented.
Absolutely. The persecution of Jews, Roma people, political opponents, anyone deemed an enemy of the state. It's a stark reminder of, how quickly a society can just, descend into barbarism when it's fueled by that kind of hatred, that kind of fear. And it's crucial to remember this persecution was deeply, deeply intertwined with Nazi economic policies.
You're referring to the way they scapegoated Jews for Germany's economic woes,
right?
Confiscating their property, their businesses, ultimately leading to, the Holocaust.
Exactly. It's a harrowing reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and how important it is to protect the rights of all citizens, especially minorities.
Okay, let's shift our focus back to Cuba. What happened there after Castro took power? You mentioned he was driven by this vision of, social justice, economic equality, at least initially.
Yes, and he moved very quickly to implement his vision. He nationalized key industries, particularly those owned by American companies, and redistributed land to peasants. He was fulfilling, one of his key revolutionary promises.
So he was attempting to dismantle those power structures that had kept Cuba economically dependent on the United States for so long.
Precisely. And while his methods, they were often heavy-handed, there's no doubt that his reforms, they did improve the lives of many Cubans, particularly in terms of access to healthcare, to education.
Your research mentions these ambitious literacy campaigns and the introduction of free healthcare for all citizens. Those sound like significant achievements.
They were. However, these reforms, they came at a cost. Castro's nationalization of industries and his close ties to the Soviet Union, this led to a U.S. trade embargo, which really crippled the Cuban economy. And while he spoke of, social justice, he was ruthless in silencing any opposition to his rule.
So a classic case of one step forward, two steps back.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
It's a complex legacy. Castro's Cuba, it saw genuine progress on social issues, but at the expense of political freedom and economic prosperity.
So we see these two very different leaders, Hitler and Castro, both rising to power amidst this, economic turmoil, both promising a brighter future, and yet both ultimately creating authoritarian regimes that suppressed dissent and concentrated power in the hands of, well, a select few.
It's a pattern that appears, again and again throughout history, which begs the question, is true equality, true freedom, is it even attainable under an authoritarian regime?
Right.
No matter how well-intentioned it may seem at the outset, or is there something inherently contradictory about that very notion?
Yeah, it's almost like a paradox, right? This pursuit of a more just and equitable society, but then it leads to the very systems that it, sought to dismantle.
A cautionary tale, for sure. And what's particularly concerning is how relevant these historical examples feel. I mean, even today, right? We're witnessing this rising inequality, political polarization. You've got a global cost of living crisis. I mean, it's a breeding ground for that kind of discontent that authoritarian leaders, they thrive on.
You're right to point that out. When people, when they feel economically insecure, they're more susceptible, right, to these extremist ideologies, to anyone who promises those simple solutions to complex problems.
Exactly. And often those promises, they come at a steep price. The erosion of democratic norms, the suppression of dissent, the concentration of power in the hands, of a select few.
Yeah, it's almost as if they become so desperate, right, for stability, for security, that they're willing to actually sacrifice their freedom to get it.
That's the danger, even today, which is why it is absolutely crucial to be vigilant in protecting those democratic institutions and norms, especially during those times of, economic uncertainty.
You've given us a lot to think about today. It can feel overwhelming, but I keep coming back to that idea that knowledge is power.
Right.
Like understanding how these dynamics, how they played out in the past, it can help us all, I think, to make more informed choices in the present.
I wholeheartedly agree. And it's not just about, recognizing those warning signs of authoritarianism. Yeah. It's about, that root cause. It's addressing the root causes. Inequality, injustice, that's what creates that fertile ground for these movements to take root in the first place.
So what you're saying is like investing in things like education, healthcare, those social safety nets, these are all like crucial steps in preventing history from, repeating itself.
Precisely.
Yeah.
We need to create a more just, a more equitable world.
Right.
Where everyone, they have the opportunity to thrive. I think that's the best antidote to that kind of despair and resentment, that can fuel authoritarianism.
It's a tall order for sure, but as you said, these historical parallels, they remind us, just how urgent the task really is.
And while the challenges are significant, I remain hopeful throughout history. You've seen it time and time again. People, they have the power, right, to resist tyranny and to fight for a better future.
Well said. It's a powerful reminder that we all have a role to play in safeguarding, our freedoms. This has been a doubly insightful, if somewhat unsettling, deep dive. So thank you for guiding us through these complex historical parallels.
It's been my pleasure.
And for you listening, we want to leave you with one final thought. Our discussion today, it highlighted this debate that's going on among historians about whether it's those external factors, right? So like a global economic crisis or the specific choices of individuals, like Hitler's strategic maneuvering or even Castro's revolutionary ideology, which played a bigger role in the rise of these authoritarian regimes. So as you delve further into your own research, which side do you find yourself leaning towards and why? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.